I never expected a luxury neighborhood to declare war on a line of trees, and I definitely never expected that war to end with half their community buried under its own mistakes. Now, before anybody starts imagining some movie villain sitting on a porch plotting revenge, that's not what happened. Truth is, when this whole thing started, I was more concerned about soil moisture than neighborhood drama. I had spent most of my life on a ranch outside a small Arizona town called Dry Creek Junction, a place where the wind never really stops moving and the land teaches humility, whether you want the lesson or not. My name's Wade Mercer, and for nearly 23 years I've been working the same stretch of ground my father left me. It wasn't glamorous land. No golf courses, no fountains, no decorative stone entrances with fancy names carved into them. Just dirt, cattle, mesquite trees, and enough stubbornness to survive drought after drought. The most important thing on that property wasn't my barn, my fences, or even my water wells. It was a windbreak, a long line of mesquite and cedar trees running along my western boundary. Most people looked at those trees and saw shade. I looked at them and saw 20 years of protection. Those trees slowed down wind that could strip topsoil right off the ground. They held moisture, protected grazing areas, kept dust from turning into a problem. Every rancher around here understood that. Well, almost every rancher. About 8 months before everything exploded, a new development went up half a mile east of my property. They called it Canyon Crest Estates. You know the type. Rows of identical houses. Lawns so green, they looked photoshopped. Perfect sidewalks. Perfect landscaping. Perfect little signs reminding people where perfection was allowed and where it wasn't. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People move in. People move out. Life goes on. Then one afternoon, I got my first visit. I was repairing a fence near the county road when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a woman named Victoria Hale. She was president of the Canyon Crest HOA. Early 50s. Expensive sunglasses. Sharp smile. The kind of person who looked like she had never lost an argument in her life. She walked over with 2 board members trailing behind her and introduced herself. Mr. Mercer, we're excited to be your new neighbors. I remember smiling and thinking that's usually how bad conversations begin. We talked for a few minutes. Weather, growth in the area, property values, and she got to the real reason she'd come. She pointed toward my tree line. Some of our residents have mentioned those trees block the sunset view from our clubhouse. I laughed before I could stop myself. Not because she was joking, because she wasn't. Victoria didn't laugh back. She just stood there waiting. Finally, I said, "Ma'am, those trees aren't decoration." She folded her arms. "We were wondering if you'd consider trimming them." I looked at the trees, and I looked back at her. "Would you consider removing the roof from your clubhouse so I can see more sky?" One of the board members nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Victoria didn't appreciate the joke. Her smile tightened. "Those views are important to our homeowners." I nodded. "And keeping my soil on my property is important to me." That was the end of the conversation. At least that's what I thought. For days later, I left for an agricultural conference in New Mexico. Nothing unusual. I'd attended similar events for years. Before leaving, I walked my western boundary one last time, checking fences, checking irrigation lines, checking those trees. Everything looked fine, healthy, strong, exactly where it belonged. I had no idea it would be the last time I'd see them standing. The conference lasted 4 days. On the drive home, somewhere around sunset, I started noticing something strange. Dust. Not unusual dust. Heavy dust. The kind that hangs in the air longer than it should. The closer I got to my property, the worse it became. A bad feeling settled into my stomach. Every landowner knows that feeling. When you've worked the same ground long enough, you can sense when something isn't right before you even see it. Then I turned onto my access road, and my heart dropped, because where my windbreak should have been, there was nothing, just open sky, and a jagged line of broken stumps stretching across the horizon. The trees were gone, every single one of them, and standing there beside the destroyed tree line, with dust already lifting from the exposed soil into the evening air, I realized this wasn't an accident. Somebody had decided they had the right to change my land. They just hadn't realized what those trees were really holding back. I climbed out of my truck and just stood there for a minute, staring at what was left. You hear people talk about anger all the time, but real anger isn't loud at first. It's quiet. It's that strange moment when your brain keeps trying to convince you there's another explanation because the obvious one is too ridiculous to accept. I walked the entire length of the damage. Fresh tire tracks, splintered trunks, with chips scattered everywhere. Some of those trees had been growing since before Canyon Crest Estates even existed on a blueprint. Now they looked like somebody had dragged a giant lawnmower through 20 years of work. About halfway down the line, I found a laminated notice attached to my fence. Not my fence post. My fence. My property. The notice was full of official-sounding language about visibility improvements, community safety enhancements, and vegetation management. There was no signature for me. No permit attached. No authentication. Just a statement written as if the decision had already been made. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes stupidity reaches a level so impressive it becomes almost artistic. I folded the paper, put it in my pocket, and headed toward my barn. On the way, I called my neighbor, Earl Dawson. Earl had been ranching longer than I'd been alive. If common sense ever took human form, it'd probably look like Earl. When he arrived 30 minutes later, he walked the boundary with me in silence. Then he stopped, spit into the dirt, and said, "Well, that's going to be expensive." I nodded. "That's one word for it." "You calling a lawyer?" "Probably." "You calling the county?" "Probably." Earl looked toward Canyon Crest. Then he looked at the exposed ground. "Wynn's gonna love this." That sentence stayed with me. "Wynn's gonna love this." Because he was right. The next morning, I started seeing the first signs. Small streaks of loose soil shifting east. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anybody driving by would notice. But I noticed. The land was already reacting. And that's the thing people don't understand about ranching. The land is always talking. Most folks just don't know how to listen. By noon, I had security footage pulled from cameras near my equipment shed. The cameras didn't cover everything, but they covered enough. Around noon on the second day of my trip, 2 bulldozers entered through a maintenance gate near the HOA property line. A contractor truck followed. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Somebody had crossed onto my property. Somebody had removed those trees. And somebody was about to have a very bad month. I sent copies to my attorney. Then I called the county. Then I called a local environmental consultant I'd worked with before. By evening, I had confirmation of exactly what I already knew. Removing that windbreak had destabilized the soil. The only question was how quickly the consequences would arrive. The answer came from the weather report. 40-mile-per-hour gusts. Expected within 24 hours. Dry conditions. Low humidity. No rain. Perfect conditions. Or terrible conditions, depending on which side of the fence you lived on. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was planning anything illegal. Not because I was plotting revenge. I was thinking about choices. About consequences. About how some people assume the world operates like a boardroom meeting where everything can be controlled with enough confidence. Land doesn't work that way. Nature doesn't care how important you think you are. Around sunrise, I climbed onto my tractor. I drove out to the damaged strip and started working the soil. Slowly, methodically, breaking up compacted sections left behind by the bulldozers. Repairing drainage paths. Managing my property exactly the way I had every legal right to do. If somebody had driven by, it would have looked completely ordinary. Routine ranch work. Nothing more. By late afternoon, the forecast arrived right on schedule. The wind started as a steady breeze. Then stronger gusts rolled across the valley. The kind that make fence wires hum. The kind that bend grass flat against the earth. I stood near my boundary fence watching. The first dust lifted around 4 o'clock. Tiny particles at first. Barely noticeable. Then more. Then more. Within minutes, the exposed soil began moving in sheets. Not exploding upward. Flowing. Almost like water. A slow-moving river made entirely of dust. And, unfortunately, for Canyon Crest Estates, the river had only one direction to travel. East. Straight toward their front entrance. I watched the first wave cross the open ground. Then another. Then another. Each one larger than the last. The decorative stone monument at the entrance started disappearing from the bottom up. Their imported landscaping vanished beneath drifting layers of dust. Perfect flower beds became indistinguishable from the surrounding dirt. Cars entering the neighborhood slowed down. Some stopped completely. People got out and stared. Confused. Concerned. A little panicked. By 5 o'clock, the HOA clubhouse was barely visible through the haze. By 6, the neighborhood looked like it had been dropped into the middle of a desert storm. My phone rang. I ignored it. It rang again. Ignored. Then again. Same number. Finally, I answered. Victoria's voice came through immediately. What did you do? No hello. No introduction. Just accusation. I leaned against a fence post, watched another cloud roll across the entrance, and said, Good afternoon to you two. Wait, this isn't funny. I agree. Our neighborhood is being buried. I looked across the property line. That's unfortunate. You caused this. There was genuine anger in her voice now. Real panic, too. I could hear it underneath. I let a few seconds pass. Then I said, No, Victoria. What caused this was somebody destroying a 20-year-old windbreak. Silence. Not long, but long enough. Then she switched tactics. Maybe a misunderstanding. Maybe a contractor made a mistake. Maybe somebody crossed a line accidentally. Funny how quickly certainty disappears when consequences arrive. I listened. Then I said, You know what's interesting? My attorney already has the footage. Silence again. I also shared copies with a local reporter. Longer silence. The kind where somebody suddenly realizes the conversation isn't going the way they expected. Finally, she spoke. What do you want? That question told me everything. Not what happened. Not who was responsible. Not how to fix the damage. What do you want? Because for the first time, she understood she wasn't managing a neighborhood dispute anymore. She was managing liability. I want my trees back. The line went quiet. Then she said, We'll discuss this. And she hung up. The storm kept moving. The next day, things got worse. Emergency crews arrived. Maintenance vehículos. Utility trailers. Small loaders trying to clear accumulated dirt. Residents started posting videos online. Those videos spread fast. A luxury community fighting a dust invasion made for surprisingly entertaining content, especially after people learned why it was happening. Then came the homeowners. And homeowners can be remarkably supportive of an HOA, right up until the HOA starts affecting property values. Suddenly, residents wanted answers. Who approved the removal? Why wasn't the landowner consulted? Why weren't environmental assessments performed? Why was private property entered without permission? Questions turned into complaints. Complaints turned into demands. Demands turned into emergency meetings. One resident reportedly stood up during a board meeting and asked a question that became local legend. If they thought they were smart enough to remove the trees, why aren't they smart enough to stop the dust? Nobody had an answer, because there wasn't one. And while Canyon Crest leadership scrambled to explain what happened, the pressure kept building from every direction. Residents, lawyers, county officials, local media. And by the end of that week, I heard something I never expected to hear. The HOA board was starting to turn on Victoria herself, which meant the people who had once acted like they controlled everything were finally learning a lesson the land had been trying to teach them all along. Actions don't disappear. Sometimes they just take a little while to come back. And when they do, they usually bring friends. About 8 days after the trees came down, I heard another vehicle coming up my driveway. This time I knew it wasn't going to be a confrontation. You develop a feel for those things. The way people park, the way they walk, the energy they bring with them. And when I stepped onto my porch that morning, the difference was obvious immediately. Victoria wasn't leading the group. That alone told me more than any conversation could. There were 4 people standing near my gate. Victoria, 2 HOA board members, and a man I recognized as one of the larger homeowners in Canyon Crest. Nobody looked particularly confident. Nobody looked particularly happy. Most importantly, nobody looked like they were there to make demands. I invited them onto the porch. We sat down. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt almost uncomfortable. Then Victoria finally cleared her throat. Wade, we'd like to discuss a solution. A week earlier, she would have called it a negotiation. Now it was a solution. Funny how language changes when leverage changes. I nodded. I'm listening. For the next 20 minutes, they laid everything out. Professional soil consultants, temporary erosion barriers, replacement trees, landscape restoration, compensation for damages. It was actually a serious proposal. For the first time since this whole mess began, I got the sense that somebody had finally started listening to experts instead of assumptions. When they finished, everyone looked at me, waiting. I leaned back in my chair, looked out toward the property line where my trees used to stand. Then I said something that surprised them. That's a good start. You could almost feel the relief hit the group all at once. But I wasn't finished. A start isn't the same thing as finished. Their shoulders tightened again, and then I gave them my conditions. Every inch of the windbreak would be rebuilt. Same length, same density, same function. Not because it looked nice, because it worked. They would pay for a professional installation, professional irrigation, professional maintenance. Any tree that died would be replaced. No exceptions, no shortcuts, no disappearing after the first photo opportunity. The second condition was even simpler. For 5 years, Canyon Crest would contribute toward long-term land stabilization and environmental protection projects along the share boundary. Monthly payments, scheduled in writing, enforceable. Miss a payment and the agreement would be reviewed immediately. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Because at that point, everybody understood the math. The cost of fixing the problem was painful. The cost of not fixing it was much worse. The homeowner sitting beside Victoria finally spoke. What happens if we agree? I looked toward the open land between us. The same thing that would have happened if nobody touched the trees in the first place. He nodded slowly. For the first time all morning, somebody smiled. A real smile. Not a political smile. Not a corporate smile. Just somebody relieved to hear there was actually a path forward. The paperwork took another couple weeks. Lawyers got involved. Environmental consultants got involved. Engineers got involved. A lot of people made a lot of money writing reports. That's usually how these things go. But eventually the agreements were signed. Construction crews arrived. New trees were planted. Temporary wind barriers went up. Soil retention systems were installed. And little by little, the land started healing. Nature is surprisingly forgiving when people stop fighting it. The funny part is what happened afterward. For months, residents from Canyon Crest would slow down when driving past my property. Some waved. Some apologized. A few even stopped to ask questions about ranching. One couple brought homemade peach cobbler. I'm still not entirely sure if it was an apology or a peace offering. Either way, it was excellent. Even Victoria changed. I wouldn't exactly call us friends. Let's not get carried away. But one afternoon, nearly a year later, she stopped by while I was repairing a fence. We talked for a while. No lawyers, no arguments, no drama. Just two people standing in the Arizona sun. At one point, she looked toward the young replacement trees. Then she said something I hadn't expected. You know, I never understood what those trees actually did. I drove another staple into the fence post. Most people don't. She nodded. I thought it was just about the view. Most people think that too. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she laughed. A genuine laugh this time. That was a very expensive sunset. I couldn't help laughing too. Probably the most expensive sunset in county history. And honestly, that was the moment the whole thing finally ended. Not when contracts were signed. Not when the dust stopped blowing. Not when lawyers got paid. It ended when somebody finally understood the difference between appearance and function. Because that's what this story was really about. Not trees. Not dust. Not even the HOA. It was about assumptions. About what happens when people believe they understand a system they never bothered to learn. Whether it's land, business, relationships, or communities, the pattern is always the same. People see the visible part, the surface, the easy explanation. They don't see the invisible systems quietly holding everything together underneath. And sometimes those invisible systems matter a lot more than anyone realizes. Until they're gone. Now, I know some of you listening are probably thinking I should have gone straight to court. Some of you probably think I was too patient. Others probably think I wasn't patient enough. Maybe you're right. Maybe all of you are right. The truth is, life rarely gives us clean answers. Most conflicts aren't about heroes and villains. They're about people making bad decisions, then discovering consequences they never expected. What I know for sure is this: nobody from Canyon Crest ever complained about the sunset again. And every time I drive past those new trees growing along the boundary, I remember something my father used to say: the land keeps score even when people don't. Back then, I thought it was just another old rancher saying. Turns out he was right. The land was keeping score the whole time. So now I'm curious what you think. If somebody crossed onto your property and destroyed something you'd spent decades building, would you have handled it differently? Would you have gone straight to court? Would you have fought harder? Or would you have done exactly what I did and let reality teach the lesson for you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because these kinds of disputes happen more often than most people realize, and honestly, the right answer isn't always obvious. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who has strong opinions about HOAs, property rights, or difficult neighbors. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response isn't revenge. Sometimes it's simply allowing consequences to arrive exactly where they're headed.